Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for coming to this session, and a big thank you goes to the organizing committee of Asia TEFL this year for putting together this hybrid conference. My name is Chang. I'm currently an assistant professor in the Department of Foreign Languages and Literatures at National Taiwan University. The title of my presentation today is English Medium Instruction for Whom and for What? Rethinking the Language-Content Relationship in Higher Education. The presentation today is part of a newly published paper of mine that can be found in the journal Language, Culture, and Curriculum. If you would like to read the paper, you may scan the QR code on this slide to get access. So the definition of EMI. Here, I would like to invoke Carroll's widely cited definition, where he understands EMI as the use of the English language to teach academic subjects other than English itself in countries or jurisdictions where the first language of the majority of the population is not English. In this conceptual paper, I explore how current understandings of EMI can be refined to inform language policymaking and practice in higher education. As we know, discourses surrounding EMI have been largely positive on the national level, institutional level, and individual level. For example, oftentimes we hear connections of EMI with discourses of national competitiveness, raising institutions' internationalization, ranking, and prestige. However, while such grand rhetoric has attracted much enthusiasm and excitement among the general public, there has not been enough research examining the instructional goals of EMI, or what McCarroll calls the educational objectives of the courses and programs that go through these language transitions. Therefore, in this article, I argue that without clarifying what EMI is for in an educational sense, it would be difficult, if not impossible, to evaluate the quality and success of its implementation. Here, I would like to share with you the very commonly seen language content spectrum that was first introduced by Met in 1998. Over the years, this spectrum has gone through various stages of elaboration and refinement as more and more bilingual terms emerge. So as can be seen over here, EMI is primarily content-driven, which is different from EGP, EAP, and ESB, and different from CBI, Immersion, and CLIL. EMI has an explicit focus on English, as the label of EMI suggests. So the reason this spectrum was invoked is because I seek to map out how the educational goals of EMI may be conceived by situating EMI within this wider educational concern that deals with the interplay between language and content. To be sure, this endeavor is not new, but I do so here to highlight what is potentially intended, a tentative benchmark with which the outcomes of EMI can be compared. And in this paper, I use an institutional case to reflect on whether the manifestations of EMI on the ground align with its research conceptualization, and to what extent the language content spectrum presented over here serves as a useful tool in explaining these different manifestations. The result of this investigation into the utility of the spectrum was that the interplay between language and content in the implementation of EMI was far more dynamic than what the spectrum could actually capture. Specifically, the key issue lies in the mutually exclusive complementary relationship between language and content on the continuum. For example, if a course is 100% content-driven, then there's no space dedicated to language. Or if a course is 30% about content, then 70% is open up for language. Additionally, when applied to explain instructional outcomes, it is not possible to locate on the continuum situations where little language and content is learned. Because of this, in the paper that I've just published, I move on to introduce a conceptual model as an alternative way to address the varying relationships between language and content in higher education settings. This model can be viewed as a second generation of the language content spectrum presented earlier. Like the spectrum, the model seeks to deal with the interplay between language and content. However, unlike the spectrum that conceives of language and content as mutually exclusive, This model opens up a range of possible realities to reflect how language and content interact on the ground. For example, there could be 100% focus on language and 100% focus on content. There also could be only 10% focus on each. The percentage displayed here is not an attempt to quantify language or content, but to illustrate different strengths of control as represented in the two axes. Language with 3 pluses highlights a focus on language, whereas content with 3 pluses represents a focus on content. And by control or by focus, I mean taking control of the planning, teaching, and assessment of whatever is described. The opposite of these dimensions are signified by language with 1 plus and content with 1 plus respectively, implying less emphasis but not necessarily an absence of what is labeled. So in this mapping, as you can see over here on this slide, we can see that this model allows various bilingual terms to be arranged into groups and mapped onto the model according to their localized definition. For example, during my fieldwork, I was able to interview and observed 17 classes and the lectures of these classes. And this allowed me to understand how these EMI lectures understood the instructional goals of their EMI courses. And then I was able to plot these different courses onto this model to see how EMI is envisioned. So this is kind of a synchronic mapping that was done. Furthermore, the model may also be utilized to capture the temporal movement of EMI. So this signifies diachronic mapping. Specifically, as EMI unfolds in the process of policymaking, curriculum planning, and teaching, it could occupy any position in this model. For instance, while the conceptualization of EMI may start from quadrant 1 or 2, it may face the risk of shifting to quadrant 3 in its implementation if little planning is done. And this is a space that does not exist on the language content continuum, which makes this model especially important. Due to time constraints, I will not be able to go further into how this model is different from other competing ones, but I would just like to reiterate the importance of this model, why this model is important. So although the division of the quadrants in the language content model may be somewhat artificial, the parameters that highlight their differences are necessary for analytical purposes. These are meaningful distinctions that will help with the cross-pollination of research through a constrained level of inferencing and without blindly borrowing or transferring a trending bilingual label from one context to another. So finally, I would just like to leave with you some questions. I would love to hear your observations, experience, and thoughts later. The first one is, what are your hopes and concerns for EMI? The second one, how does your institution envision the instructional goals of EMI? What has your institution done to facilitate the attainment of these goals? What more can be done? And third, how do you as an EMI instructor envision the instructional goals of EMI? What have you done to help your students attain these goals? And what are the outcomes? Thank you very much. And if you would like to continue this conversation, you may send me an email at cindychang@ntu.edu.tw.